Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. One of the first things you want to do is safely raise and support the front of your vehicle so the wheels are off the ground and the suspension is hanging. After that, remove all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts and then the wheel. Now with the wheels off of there, let's move along to our 36mm axle nut. Go ahead and remove that. Make sure the axle breaks free from the wheel bearing. If it doesn't, you can use a hammer and a punch right in the center. The next thing that we're going to pay attention to is our ABS wire. That's this wire right here. What we want to do is follow that wire all the way up to the point that it connects onto the body. You can see this bracket. Let's go ahead and use a 10mm to remove that, and then we can start disconnecting the ABS wiring harness. Now for this harness, right where my index finger is, you can see that there's a rectangular tab. When I squeeze on this, it's going to lift up on the other end, and I should be able to separate this. Every time you disconnect an electrical connector, take a peek. If you see any funny colors, it's corrosion and it would need to be dealt with. This one looks fine, so I can go ahead and set that aside. Now we can continue on to this area right here. You're going to find one more 10mm headed bolt. Go ahead and remove that, and that's going to take off the bracket for the ABS wire. Now we can move along to this area right here. You're going to find 2 19mm headed bolts that come through from the rear towards the front. On the front, you'll find a 22mm nut. Let's go ahead and remove the pair. Now with the nuts off there, we can continue on by pressing this in and out, and you should be able to remove both of the bolts. As you remove them, you need to give them a good inspection to make sure they're still reusable. Now let's make sure that we put this in the upright position so we can grab onto the rotor here, and we're going to carefully start pulling the knuckle down and away from the strut, being very careful not to damage our flex hose or ABS wire in any way. Just lean this off to the side. Moving up this way, you're going to find your outer tie rod end. Typically, you're going to find a cotter pin that holds this together. We'll just go ahead and remove that cotter pin, set it aside. Now we can remove our 16mm headed nut. Got a couple washers on there. Now let's continue on with our hammer, and we're going to give this a couple loving bonks just along this area, but you want to be very careful not to damage the threads or the boot of your outer tie rod end. Once it's broken free, just go ahead and give it a quick inspection and set it aside. Now we can make our way under the hood, and you'll notice on either side where the strut tower is, you have 3 mounting nuts that hold your strut to the body. I'm going to go ahead and use a 15mm to start removing these. Once I get to the last one, I'm going to make sure I'm holding onto that strut from inside the wheel well while I remove the final nut. Okay. There it is, friends. Okay friends, now it's time to install our brand new front strut assembly. Looking up along the top, you can see your strut mount. That's going to need to fit right up inside here and line up with the mounting bolt holes on the body. Let's go ahead and carefully get that in there, and then we can start on all 3 of our mounting nuts. Now we can bottom these out. We'll get back to torquing these in a minute. Now we can start putting everything back together down inside the wheel well here. Let's start with our bolts that hold the knuckle to the strut. Get this in position. Go ahead and start your bolts right through. red thread locker. Another on there. Now that I have both of these started, I can go ahead and snug them up. After I've snugged them, I'm going to torque each of them to 118 foot-pounds. Let's make our way up to the outer tie rod end. I removed some washers, so I'll make sure I put them back in there. Now we can go ahead and snug this up. Once it's bottomed out, torque it to 32 foot-pounds. Now the next thing you're going to want to do is pay attention to the nut on the outer tie rod end. You can see looking at it, it has basically all these little castle-ended slots. On the stud for the tie rod end, it also has a hole, and that hole needs to line up with one of the slots. Go ahead and try putting this cotter pin in there. If it doesn't feel like it wants to go in, you need to continue tightening until the very next slot does. Make sure you peen that over to lock it in. Now we can move along to resecuring our brake flex hose. Before we do, just double check to make sure it doesn't look like it's twisted in any way. If you're looking at it and it looks like it makes a little curly cue, that means that you twisted the caliper, in which case you'd have to remove it, spin it around, and then just make sure it looks like it's in this position here. Assuming it looks good, let's go ahead and take this. We'll get it into position. We'll take our mounting bolts, start that in by hand. Once it's started in, you can go ahead and snug it up. Now it's time to start dealing with the ABS wire. Looking at the bracket, you can see that it has the hole, and then it has that little curved tab. Looking at the strut, you can see you have two holes. You want to make sure that you have the bolt hole lined up and the tab lined up. Let's go ahead and take this. We're going to bring it right underneath the flex hose here. You don't want to put it up and over the top. Now we can line up that bolt hole. We'll start the bolt in there and snug it up. Now we can move along to the rest of this. Let's reconnect in that ABS wire before we reconnect the bracket. Get a little click, give it a tug to make sure it's 100% secured. Now we're going to line up our bolt hole and our little tab with the bolt hole and the tab hole. Start in that mounting bolt. Let's apply some red thread locker to our axle stud. Let's get the nut on there. We'll bottom this out by hand, get the wheel closer to the ground, and then we can torque this. Now with this closer to the ground, I went ahead and I took a pry bar carefully across my studs just like this. That's going to prevent this from spinning on me while I continue torquing this axle nut. When I torque the axle nut, I'm going to torque it to 181 foot-pounds. The next thing you want to do is pay attention to the slot on the axle stud. We want to make sure that we go ahead and drive this nut end down into that to make sure it's locked in. Once you're sure it's peened down, we can continue. Let's get the wheel back on here. We'll start on all the lug nuts, bottom them out, get the wheel back on the ground, and then we'll torque each lug nut to 80 foot-pounds. Now with the full weight of the vehicle back on the ground, let's go ahead and torque each of these nuts to 33 foot-pounds. Torqued. Okay friends, we got one strut in there. Now typically when you do a strut, you're going to want to make sure you do them as a pair. The process for the other side of the vehicle will be the exact same thing. After you go ahead and replace the pair, make sure you get yourself safely down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.